Welcome to the Philosopher and the Monk. We have a really special podcast. RJ, we have a special guest.
Yes, we have Timothy Conway. He's a non-dual teacher. He has a PhD from the California Institute of Integral Studies. I saw a book on Amazon called Women of Power and Grace, subtitle, 9 Astonishing, Inspiring Luminaries of Our Time. And just as a side note, James, you used the word astonishment in one of your books as well. So there's a connection there.
Yeah. Timothy, it's just so nice to see you. I have to say, on my journey, whenever I needed to understand something a little deeper or explore, your website was such a solid, it gave me solace. It was such a treasure trove of wisdom, and now you're right here in front of us. Like you said, can I say it? The cyber flesh.
Yeah, with the miracle of Zoom technology. I mean, we had it with Skype, and I guess Apple users have FaceTime, but for Zoom, it's such an intimate way of allowing not just the intimacy of the voice, which we've had for a century on the telephone, but to be able to have the extra nuances of how the light sparkles in the dear one's eyes, and it's so much easier to read, like humor and irony and subtlety, which sometimes on the phone you could sometimes hear it in the tone of voice, but if it wasn't a good connection. So it just allows this beautiful celebration of the fact that the great formless, suprapersonal, transcendent reality is personing.
Yes.
By the gazillions throughout the cosmos, and 7.9, almost 8 billion humans, and countless trillions of animal persons we share this planet with. So to be able to celebrate this is love.
Yes.
An occasion for great gratitude, spontaneous, non-dual gratitude.
And here on the podcast, we try to think of maybe people in our family or our neighbors or someone who's watching who is a little stuck or suffering, and they might not know about this. As I grew up Catholic and then quickly became an atheist. I was an atheist by 14 or so. And just never, and RJ was raised secular, so a little more Buddhism and Taoism, but we didn't know about this non-dual reality at all. And maybe you can just lay out the map of what's happening, that there's something deeper underneath the suffering that they can get to, and how we can get there.
Well, let's start with suffering. Lord Buddha, 2,500 years ago, certainly started with that basic fact. The suffering is this intense upset and anguish and trauma, often. And sometimes it's just kind of selfish self-pity and, holding grudges and stuff, and it feels crappy. But all of this suffering happens for this sense of a personal consciousness. And suffering is a reaction to pain, physical or emotional. And pain is a useful signal. Without these useful signals of physical or emotional pain, any species would not survive, because there would be no motive to flee or say fight back or find some tactic to avoid being eaten by a predator or badly damaged by, falling boulders or an avalanche or something. So there's suffering, which is optional. And then pain is a fact of psychobiological existence on this planet. And it happens in other realms, the subtle realms beyond this earth. And pain itself is in turn arising from some kind of intensity. At bottom, it's all intensity. What we think of as solid matter is really immaterial quantum foam fields of energy. I mean, if you want to accept, and most theoretical physicists accept it, the idea of some kind of superstring theory, or M theory, as Edward Witten speaks of it, all the structures appearing in the cosmos. And let's face it, most of the cosmos is just hydrogen and helium, but on planets such as ours that, arose evolutionarily. So all of this arises from this grand no thing, this transcendent reality that's doing everything and being everyone. It knows how to vibrate these very, very infinitesimal differences, these differentiated patterns of energy that can give rise to, like, say, planet Earth and our various biospheres, ecosystems, all the different kinds of creatures. And then these creatures are programmed to respond to certain kinds of intensity of vibration in their very fluid and malleable body-mind experiential reality, organismic existence, we could say for short. Now, let's be clear at the start, when you speak of like the body or the mind, it's so easy with certain Western languages like English to just make it a thing, a noun. But what is the body, really? It's just 70 trillion cells or 60 trillion cells, depending on your mass, your size, dozens of organ systems. And, beneath the cells, all the miracles of DNA and RNA, and down to molecular structures and amino acids and everything, and down to atoms, to subatomic mystery, down to those loops and blobs of curved hyperspace vibrating in 11 dimensions, as the superstring or M theorist might say. James, I love the title of your book, The Gospel of Astonishment, because just reading some basic physics and biology, the stuff on the edge of, like, how do systems arise and what are they fundamentally, quote, made of? And how do they function? It's mystery all the way down, and all the best scientists have always admitted this. They don't pretend to be know-it-alls just to get their next round of grant funding. You have to sound like a know-it-all when you're in that academic world of science, because you're always dependent on funding. Even when you're a tenured professor, if there's going to be any kind of experiments conducted, there often needs to be supplemental funding. So you have to pretend like a know-it-all. Or like, just give us, these $5 million for this quarter, and we'll have the answers for you in about a year and a half,
It could also
You
be
read
funding.
like basic pop science articles back in I'm talking about like in Time or Newsweek magazine or the New York Times, the kind of attitude of the science writers and reporters, and many scientists themselves speaking to the reporters and to the public. In the 90s, you had this sense that such smugness. There was even the TOE, the theory of everything, the feeling like it was, just give us a little more time, another year or two, we'll have it all figured out, a theory of everything. Well, then the mysteries began to just pour forth, like Alan Guth and Andre Linde speaking about the inflationary moment before the Big Bang, where everything arises out of the no thing. There's some kind of mysterious decay of the false vacuum, and then the true vacuum arises, and inflationary field gives rise to this massive growth from, absolutely infinitesimal, tiny Planck size, up to about the size of a large grapefruit or small soccer ball. And that then slowly unfolds and then gives rise to matter and the play of hydrogen and helium and the birth of stars and galaxies of stars. And then people like Fred Hoyle in the 50s and 60s were astonished when he found out that, why are there heavier elements beyond hydrogen and helium? Why are there? And he was an avowed atheist, he finally declared, it's super obvious to me that there's a super intellect that has monkeyed with the basic laws of physics, chemistry, and probably biology as well, because he says what goes on in not first generation, but second generation stars and later, it's too complex to describe the processes, and I'm not myself an astrophysicist, but I used to read a lot of these guys from like age 17, 18 onward when they'd publish. I'd read the abstracts and conclusions and stuff and get a sense for what they thought the importance of what they were studying was all about. Fred Hoyle said, what's going on in stars involves things like beta decay and so forth. This generation of the heavier elements of our periodic table, like carbon and iron and zinc and silicon and so forth, is miraculous. It's absolutely miraculous. There's no way this could be happening by chance. No way. And I began to read and find out that so many of the scientists were actually devout believers in some kind of divine reality or intelligence, some unbelievable spiritual principle that is doing everything and being everyone. So non-duality, you wanted an explanation of that for your listeners. It's the simple realization that there is a single reality, mysterious in terms of what it is, but obviously beable because it's being each of us, each and every one. The single reality is doing everything, orchestrating everything, and being everyone. And as the sentience by which sentient beings feel those forms of intensity that are biologically, evolutionarily useful as noticing pain so that we'll respond appropriately, and also empathy so that we empathize with fellow beings' pain. And then the suffering starts to be let go of more and more when you trust. There must be an incredible beauty and exquisiteness to how and what and why the single reality, the spiritual principle, call it the supreme Brahman, Atman, the reality, self of the ancient Upanishads, our most ancient wisdom tradition from ancient India, several hundred years before the Buddha, or the Buddha nature, or what they would call the Tao over in China, and what in Western tradition, Jesus simply calls in a very personable and intimate and warm term, Abba, which doesn't mean the father, it means more like dad, Papa. So when we say our Father who art in heaven, it can be our daddy or our Papa who loves us and is us. And through the vibration, the primordial word of God, the Logos, as they knew it in Greek Christian term, this is what gives rise to the vibrations that have the seed or set of seeds for differentiation. And that's how you get a variegated cosmos. And on the subtle planes, worlds high and low, denser vibrations, darker, more constricted, angry or sad, suffering kind of vibrations, to these really exalted kind of high deva, deity realms. And one reality, dreaming all of this, conjuring all of this up, and not as an outside boogeyman remote father figure who's looking at all his creatures and wondering, how are they measuring up? Will they pass my test? No, it's nothing like this. God is beyond all and yet within all as their very essential sentience, their capacity to feel, to relate and feel the energy of relationship, to love one another, to have upsets and pains, intense pains, trauma even, threat of great trauma, like what's happening in Ukraine right now under the invasion of the deranged soul, Vladimir Putin. Even his own troops apparently are just so disgusted and upset and frightened of what their commander-in-chief has done to them. They didn't expect this. They thought they were going to go do some peacemaking in the eastern territories of Ukraine, but now they find themselves, bombing civilians and killing children and moms and dads. So this singular reality is so pure, so pristine, so spiritual. Jesus said, God is spirit and must be worshipped in this pristine spirit and truth, utterly formless, transcendent. And yet this same apparently remote absolute is the very personhood of every one of these gazillions of persons throughout the cosmos. The one who is absolutely unaffected and quiescent, utterly still, changeless, timeless, eternal, ever free, not like anything. And yet this same reality is being everything and everyone, and all the dynamism and dance of relationship and feeling and experience with these miraculous body-mind levels.
So to tap into that when you're suffering, you have to slow down somewhere. Like you said, you have to trust that there's something more beautiful, or you have to trust in astonishment. You have to trust that all is well, and you have to slow down. But I think someone said today, nowadays, to be a contemplative is like making a U-turn in a rush hour traffic. It's not easy to slow down,
No. And what happens is, I promise you, just a bit of sincerity and curiosity. Sincerity will lead to the great love, and curiosity will lead to the great wisdom, the penetrating, revelatory wisdom of the nature of reality. These will bring a contemplative clarity, and it's important that this be allowed to live and function and flourish in the midst of relationship, work, mingling within society. Because our true nature is suprapersonal. Prior to the whole universal play of consciousness and its objects and processes and dynamics, this original absolute awareness plays as the universal field of consciousness, which is dynamic and vibrating and differentiating and personing as these gazillions of persons. And then each personal consciousness, which is the miraculous instrument by which the absolute suprapersonal experiences relationship and life and creativity and working and serving for the commonweal, the public good. This all happens spontaneously. The personal consciousness is the instrument, the spontaneous divine instrument for interpersonal experiencing and personal adventuring, transforming, waking up, becoming enlightened. So, for instance, there's been a huge misunderstanding about the Buddha's teaching of anatta. It often, even by Buddhist scholars and translators, has been translated as no self or no person. But the Buddha, if you actually read the best translations of the Pali Canon literature started right after the Buddha, they were orally collecting all of this. And he spoke with such beautiful cadences and rhythms and these mnemonic devices like the Four Noble Truths and the Seven Enlightenment Factors and so forth, that it was very easy for those teachings to be remembered. It's why he is, of all the ancients, among spiritual teachers, the one for whom we have the most authentically reliable body of teachings. This has been proven by scholars, especially in the last 15, 20 years. And when the Buddha teaches anatta, it's always in the context of, let's examine and feel what is personhood. And he starts with the bodily form. And if you're a dream at night, if you have a lucid dream, if you're aware that you're dreaming while you're dreaming, you can check what kind of rupa, is the old Pali and Sanskrit word, what kind of bodily form or vibrational form, energy body, am I associated with? Even if it's just the point of view, does it feel expansive, contracted? How does it taste? So the Buddha starts with whatever form is being identified with within a world, a body in the physical realm, this earth plane, or the, say, dream body or subtle body, which we experience in dream states and in reveries. And, Einstein used to explore that creatively, just in terms of how he could better visualize like the speed of light and this sort of thing. He'd get into a subtle body mode, really deep, profound, intricate imagination and subtle feeling, which allowed all sorts of revelations to come to him and others, scientists, artists. So the Buddha says, are we this body in this physical realm or the dream realm? And very quickly, he shows his listeners, the almsmen and almswomen, the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, and the lay persons, including kings and royalty, members of the court, and peasants, manual laborers. The Buddha shows how this body is born and it has an expiration date. And guess what? Like, say, and this is where the Vedanta teaching came in from a few of the ancient Upanishads. They specifically were speaking about the rotation every 24 hours of these so-called waking state, dream state, and the deep dreamless sleep state. That right there is actually fantastic, because it wasn't until the 1950s in the sleep laboratories up at Stanford University that psychophysiologists determined that there were two kinds of sleep: dream sleep, what is usually called rapid eye movement or REM sleep, and deep dreamless sleep, which is when the brain slows down in its electrochemical activity to electromagnetic chemical activity to these deep, from alpha to beta to delta to theta waves, and slows way down, so-called stage 4 sleep, where if you wake the person up, they're just coming right out of the vast open void. So the ancients of the Upanishads, these sages, these rishis, they knew that the body is not permanently your experience. It's not continuously your experience, because it's not there in deep dreamless sleep. They would lucidly go through the stages or in nirvikalpa samadhi, or what the Buddhists call nirodha. They just move right through the energy states, the phase shifts, and just be experiencing absolute awareness. Not even a field of consciousness with objects, but just absolute awareness. And then they would notice the play of consciousness arose, and for the personal consciousness, that is themselves, they would notice there was, it was subtle, like dream realms and deva, heaven realms, and other kind of realms, darker, more troubled, uptight realms like the asuras, the demons or titans, who were very contracted with anger and greed and pleasure mongering and pride, and basically like authoritarianism, the right-wing authoritarian personality, or the malignant narcissist. It's a modern day good exemplifications of what the Buddha and the ancients meant by the asura. But you notice the subtle plane arising and some kind of viewpoint that feels like a me, associated with some kind of a viewpoint or a body. And so the Buddha says, let me just add one thing. I've shared it with many listeners over the decades. And I know this happens more for females than males, because they've got better corpus callosum, that bundle of nerve fibers connecting the two brain hemispheres. They talk about women, and Freud said it, that women have penis envy. Well, men should have corpus callosum envy, because the female psyches are far better integrated. I found that years ago in teaching. Like one course I used to teach was called Healing Our World. It was all about social justice issues, racism, sexism, the violence perpetrated by aggressors, speciesism, what we do to animals in our food system, and so forth, brutality of it all. And I noticed I couldn't really describe much in detail to the groups because I would see the women just experiencing it so empathetically as if it was happening to them. Whereas the guys would kind of go off in their left brain hemisphere if they're right-handed. They go off into that cerebral, abstract, analytic, kind of dissociated mode. And they go, oh my God, yeah, that is terrible. And gee, 70 billion creatures every year are killed in, for food in our livestock agriculture and so forth, and poultry farming. Oh my God, that's terrible. But the women would be just like almost, if they had PTSD, they were reliving it, So all that started by saying women have better opportunity, it seems, because of that better interconnection between the brain hemispheres to flash on what's called lucid dreaming, being aware that you're dreaming while you're dreaming. Guys have them, I have them, and an old friend of mine, a mentor, Stephen LaBerge, wrote the V book on lucid dreaming back in the early 80s. I took some graduate level seminars with him. He could teach people to just lucidly dream at will. Interesting guy. Should have him on your podcast sometime. Stephen LaBerge. When you're lucid dreaming, you can have a very interesting set of forms of self-inquiry or inquiring into the nature of reality. And one of them is, notice what kind of a dream body, but then see if you can see your physical body lying on the bed or sofa or futon or hammock or wherever you parked it to go to sleep. And then you have quite clearly the realization, many of us have flashed on this, it's like, which body is, quote, mine? Or anybody's mine. People that have near-death experiences. Another course I used to teach a lot was, when I was in Santa Barbara all those 30 years, was life, death, and the afterlife. And many of my class members had the students that came, had near-death experiences. I was teaching adult education classes. We had one of the best programs in the nation in Santa Barbara. So I had people of all ages, young, middle-aged, older. Many of the middle-aged and older ones had near-death experiences or something very close. They may not have gotten the full-blown phase shift all the way through the tunnel or void and into the light and meeting benevolent ancestors and some divine figure of luminous light. They might have just had the initial popping out of the body and being above the body. They had a classic OBE, out of the body experience. And the first thing they realized, I'm not that body. It's like a suit of clothes. I unpeel and lay on the floor or the bed or whatever on the hanger at night. So back to the Buddha. In his investigation of what are we start with the bodily form, physical or subtle. And we realize these are not continuous in our experience because they're not there in deep dreamless sleep or nirvikalpa samadhi, some kind of absorption trance. Rapture, as the Christians would call it, like St. Francis would spend like 14, 18 hours a day sometimes in these formless raptures. So if the body isn't continuous, it's therefore anicca, impermanent. And we know it dies, we see it happening all around. In fact, later I'll be hosting a memorial for a dear friend of mine who dropped the body a few weeks ago, age 78. What is he now? It's not that body that we knew in Santa Barbara. So all bodies get born, they grow, they age, they die. These are the facts of bodily existence. And even in the subtle realms, the Buddha, with his great compassion and empathy and loving kindness and concern, he would share wisdom with the celestial beings, even in the highest heaven planes, and say, these states are not permanent. And then his next mark of existence after the impermanence, the anicca, the impermanence of all phenomena from the highest heavens to the hells and ghost realms and human and animal plane, they are insubstantial. They're not solid. They don't have their own being. Swabhava is a early Buddhist term. The Buddha taught that they are shunya, and later this word shunyata arises. And this is another word that, and I'll get back to that anatta, because it comes in real soon here. What people translate as no person or no self. Because everything is impermanent, everything is insubstantial, and doesn't have its own solid self nature. The truly existing absolute being is the only being. Meister Eckhart used to preach as Thomas Aquinas, certainly in Eastern traditions, among the Sufi Muslim mystics and the Jewish mystics. The teaching is that great wisdom is that when we think of ourselves or others as being and solid and objects and things, we're all made of this no thing of pure absolute spirit. So the Buddha's second mark of existence after the impermanence of everything is that therefore they are insubstantial, like a dream, like a dewdrop about to evaporate in the sun, like a rainbow about to disappear when the angle of the sunlight and moisture changes, like a mirage, like a magician's trick. The Buddha and then later beautiful Buddhist sages like Nagarjuna, about 650 years after the Buddha, according to the best scholarship on his dates. He's considered the father of Mahayana Buddhism, which spread into North India and north into China, northeast into China, Korea, Japan, straight north up into Tibet, Ladakh, and places. This Mahayana Buddhism joins the Buddha in teaching that there is no individual self-nature to different persons, beings, things, processes, structures in the cosmos. Therefore, they're like a dream. And they had this list of about 12 similes that were very common, but the dream one is the most intriguing. I won some national essay contest back in 1983, a few years into graduate school, with a paper called "This Is All a Dream." And of course, in some circles today, you hear, this is nothing but a dream, but the truth is more non-dual and inclusive of dualities. It's like, this is just a dream, insubstantial, empty, fleeting, ephemeral, dreamlike. But wow, what a dream. How is the Absolute conjuring all of this moment by vanishing moment? Because as the Buddha taught, the impermanence isn't just that, say, you're going to die and, well, we don't know when. A brain embolism could take out anyone tonight, or a texting SUV driver if you're out on the road. So, but the Buddha, his real teaching to his listeners was, everything is vanishing, moment by moment. There's the arising of formation in a moment of time, but that moment's already gone. It's already gone by the time you can even think of this moment or identify this moment. A fun one I like to share with folks is, let's hold on to the moment that's coming 5 seconds from now. 4, 3, 2, how are you going to hold it? 1, here it is. Go on. When you say the word now, by the time you get to the W, the end is already what? It's gone. What is the past? It's a construct of memory, and it's highly useful. We know pathologically from clinical psych what happens when people have no memory. My aunt had a stroke she's 90 now. She had a stroke about 1.5 years ago, and this is very difficult for her 2 adult daughters because she lost her short-term memory. She has a bunch of long-term memories and recognitions, but short-term memory is about 80% gone. So memory is miraculous. Krishnamurti would teach about freedom from the known, freedom from the known. But I tell you, anyone that actually succeeds in that is institutionalized. Memory is just one of these aspects of the mind, that glib word, the mind. It's actually this set of capacities for these miraculous functions, including making sense out of sensations as perceptions, and then being able to emotionally and volitionally, meaningfully respond to what is being sensed, perceived, and emotionally felt. I'm bringing in some ancient core teachings of the Buddha, and I'm not being real linear about it, so my apologies. It's very difficult to share these things in a linear way. But what I just said were some of the other elements the Buddha identifies as personhood. There's some kind of bodily form, and it's giving rise to sensations. And then those sensations are such a buzz, just like the body at root is quantum foam and happening out of the original no-thingness that gave rise to a physical cosmos. The sensations are being given off by bodies as they interact with other bodies, which again, no bodies are solid. They're all process and structures arising and passing moment by vanishing moment. So these sensations, if we only lived at the level of sensations, and I'm aware there's a few teachers out there that want you to just live at the level of sensation, you'll be a zombie, an overwhelmed zombie. Because if you actually tried to sit with all the sensations going on just kinesthetically in the body, from every cubic centimeter of your body, from head and face and neck and torso and groin and left arm and left hand and nerves and muscles and so forth, all the way down to the toes, you'd be overwhelmed, let alone being able to walk down a street or drive in traffic. So perception, see, there's the bodily form, rupa, and then sensation, vedana, and then sanya, there's perception. It's making sense out of it. And we know from psychology of learning and the work of people like Jerome Bruner and others back in the early 1900s and 20s and 30s, they realized that so much of our reality is a perceptual construction out of various kinds of sensations. And you can be tricked. Optical illusions do that. And the brain-mind tells a story about what's there, and it's not there. But let's not go too much into that. Because if you're just deconstructing perception all the time, you can wind up being very non-functional or dysfunctional even. And again, don't try this while driving, friends. Don't try this while trying to watch your children in a playground, and you're just unforming and loosening up perceptual structures and basically having all sorts of psychedelic stuff, and you miss the fact that your child just fell off an 8-foot slide or something, or just whacked a fellow child with a stick. In other words, we need not go back to the 60s and just feel groovy tripping out and for altered perceptions just to, quote, get high with the novelty of novel kind of experiencing. This essence is to get really clear and then just be this open, wide open, infinite spirit host, absolute awareness for whatever kind of functioning is arising in the different realms, and taking responsibility and having accountability as a personal consciousness within the great universal play of consciousness. We're getting to virtue, one of my favorite words. It's almost never talked about in neo or pseudo-Advaita non-duality circles, whether in the ones descended from certain Hindu teachers or certain Buddhists, like with the postmodernist Buddhists. There's one thing I left out. The Buddha says the personhood is a set of 5 aggregates, the panchakhandas in ancient Pali, panchaskandhas if you use Mahayana Buddhist Sanskrit to translate the ancient Buddhist teachings. But these panchakhandas, these 5 aggregates, sometimes called the heaps, you can visualize them. A meditation is visualize them all just kind of peeled off and thrown into a pile in front of you. And with the body, the 32 parts of the body meditation, as a bhikkhu for a short time up in northern Burma back in 1980, I had to learn to recite these forward and backward, the 32 parts of the body. Hair of the head, hair of the body, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bone, sinew, marrow, heart, liver, membrane, spleen, lungs, bowel, and mesentery, feces, and brain. And I always wondered why they stuck feces by brain. That immediately gave me a revelation about that wonderful word we have, shithead. Anyway, so the Buddha says, as a personal consciousness, and that is incidentally the fifth, or if you will, the first khandha, the first aggregate of personhood, there's been this association of the personal viewpoint sense, the sense of being an empirical individual. There has been this association with different rupas, different bodies over different kind of lifetimes. And in these subtle realms, you're identified with some kind of physical or subtle body form. And then it's generating sensations. And to make sense of all these countless sensations, which would just have you overwhelmed if you didn't have a valve, as the perceptual psychologist discovered, something about the processes of attention and the mind, selective attention and the mind, or capacity to process through higher levels of perception. If you didn't have you'd just be on overwhelm all the time. All the reds and blues and greens and everything, and edges and light and dark, and let alone what's going on orally with sounds. Such a person who doesn't have those valve winnowing down capacities in their ability to perceive, to make sense out of sensations. And they just be, and you find people like that institutionalized that don't have that incredible capacity. So that's why let's be careful about too many teachers, even some I respected for some of their teachings, like J. Krishnamurti, who had quite a following in the West. I used to see him in Miners Oaks, Ojai, when I was young. If you take literally some of what they're talking about, some of their deconstruction and disidentifying and insisting you are not a person, you'll only succeed in becoming a depersonalized, dysfunctional zombie.
And is that
true non-dual teachings are much subtler and more inclusive than this, and far more nuanced and fantastically beneficial and empowering.
Is that where you see the Neo-Advaita going a little bit nowadays?
Oh, it's already been there since some of these disciples of my old friend Ramesh, one of the translators for Sri Nisargadatta, and then later disciples of Papaji, and many of them were former disciples of the late Rajneesh Osho. He taught too much of this depersonalization stuff, and people wind up, in depersonalization syndrome, which is not a happy place. It's full of apathy, makes a mockery of our social justice traditions. It's like, no persons, no one is suffering, no one exists. Forms of solipsism, you're all just projections of my consciousness.
Yeah. RJ has a big problem with all that, right, RJ?
Yep, solipsism. Tim, can I ask you a quick question about sensations?
For some reason I can't hear your voice. I think I better plug in my headphone here, my little earbuds. I just stick in one. That's usually good enough. Yes, continue, RJ.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Oh, very well now. Yes.
Excellent. Just one quick question. I want you to continue what you're doing right now, because this is a great amount of information and I'm loving it. Now, as far as sensations, is that why, like, Vipassana meditation?
Vipassana? Mm-hmm.
Vipassana meditation, because it was, tell me if I'm correct, was that the Buddha's way of showing that we respond to our sensations and not the world? And if you know what's going on with your sensations, that's where you need to start with, because...
Right, because you'll see instantly these three marks or characteristics of phenomenal existence. Existence as an apparent phenomenon among other phenomena in a world. You'll find out that everything is anicca, impermanent, anatta, it's not substantial in itself, it's not solid, it doesn't have continuous, like a stream of oil, it doesn't have continuous reality throughout time and beyond time. And therefore, because everything is anicca, anatta, not truly a substantial self, therefore it's dukkha, which usually gets translated as suffering, and that's true, but it also means like the suffering of the devas and beings in the heaven realms who are going to fall from the heavens when they exhaust the good karma that got them there, or the concentrative powers that allowed them to create reality to a certain extent, a nice environment. It's what the asuras are always trying to do, control life to serve their own pleasure and power needs.
Wow.
So the Buddha teaches with vipassana, you'll notice, and then not just with the senses, but with perceptions. And this very sense of self, which is the first kind of vijnana, refers to the personal consciousness. Now he also speaks of the anidasana vijnana, which means the seamless, structureless, open consciousness, which we could call open awareness, the absolute. This suprapersonal reality, which is the host and source, substance, and animating joie de vivre and vital power, l'élan vital, the Shakti, the prana, the Om vibratory power that allows experiencing for sentient beings to happen. So the Buddha found a number of ways. Vipassana techniques are one. He also taught deep concentrative methods, but he also taught just a straight, direct wisdom. And the real origin of it and the culmination, the authentic culmination of this penetrating, deconstructive wisdom was profound loving kindness, empathetic compassion, sympathetic joy for the beings that are currently having certain joy states, so you don't feel envious or jealous. And then the profound equanimity, these four beautiful qualities, the so-called four divine abodes, the Chatur Brahma Vihara, are the beautiful metta, or maitri in Buddhist Sanskrit, the loving kindness for all beings, even the ones we may have problems with politically, might have wounded us deeply, traumatized us in life, hurt people that we love. To have loving kindness for every being, because every being is originally this pure emanation out of the Buddha nature. Mm-hmm. They've somehow gotten complicated in their association with the khandhas, the personal aggregates, in ways that are constricted and full of, the three poisons. Ignorant, delusion, that one is a separate me, and then the whole push-pull play toward other phenomena perceived as separate. One feels alienated as an exploiter or a target for what's happening. And so there's this push-pull of both the ancient Vedanta, Hinduism so-called, and Buddhism speak of these three poisons, and it's basically the root delusion that you're separate, and then the reactionary attachments and aversions, the problematically binding likes and dislikes. This doesn't mean innocent preferences, like if you're over with someone for a dinner and they say, would you rather have your asparagus and broccoli and so forth al dente or a little more well cooked? You might have a preference, or you just may not dig asparagus, so you say anything but asparagus. That's an innocent thing. Maybe it goes back to some lifetime where you actually were traumatized by, beaten up by a farmer who had a bag of asparagus over his back, so that's why you hate it. Anyway.
But being separate is that something we're born into?
It's part of the evolutionary play. Again, a sense of being differentiated enough such that, if a predatory animal jumps out of the bush and wants to gnash, gnash on your arm. That word gnash is the gnashing and wailing of teeth from the Bible. But no, if a predatory creature wants to gnash on your arm, there has to be some kind of program that feels like, this isn't just intense sensation, intense energy. strong vibration. No, it feels more like the kind of pain that is meant as a signal to get you running. Or like the Buddha, cut off your arm and give it to the tigress mother so she can feed her babies. Actually, another version of the story, he threw his whole body right off the cliff in a previous lifetime. In the Jataka tales, in a previous life, he was a meditating yogi, and he saw below that a tiger mother had become very injured, and she had her little tiger cubs, and she was so wounded, injured, she couldn't go off and bring back food to them, so they were going to starve. Her milk was drying up and so forth. And the Buddha saw what was, in his previous life, saw what was going on and threw his body down off the cliff so the mother could eat that body and have the milk to nourish her pups.
I like that a lot.
That's generosity, incidentally. Dana, generosity. And the Buddha has this gesture of the hand down. The dana, generosity of giving, unselfishly giving. Of course, he's also seen iconographically, with the hand up, the abhaya mudra, fearlessness. You are not any of these 5 khandhas. You are not the body, any kind of body. You are not the sensations. You are not even the perceptions. You are not the emotional reactions, the samskaras, the attachments and aversions and so forth, and wholesome samskaras like certain talents and aptitudes for music or poetry or political, being a statesman or stateswoman or something, or a good householder or teacher. And you are not the personal consciousness. You are the absolute.
Something that stopped us in our tracks on our journey years ago were those monks that would just set themselves on fire.
In Vietnam.
And not move, not cry, not yell.
Yeah, that, if you read the writings of Thich Nhat Hanh from the earliest period, and his wonderful associate who wound up having the ordained name Sister Chan Kong, especially her autobiography, it's very profound. She witnessed, as I recall, at least one of those self-immolations. Engaged spirituality arises in the late Thai. Thich Nhat Hanh was one of the great masters of engaged spirituality. It arises spontaneously when we truly do realize our transcendence. When we realize the supra-personal, transcendent, formless, absolute awareness, changeless, infinite, timeless, and therefore eternal. True realization, the spontaneity, this absolute beyond is immanent within, omnipresently the very substance of all the worlds and all the beings. And so spontaneously this transcendence, immanence, non-duality becomes so alive. You know that you're always just as absolutely still, formless, no world, no thing, nada. And I'm using the nada of, say, Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross. And you are everything and everyone. And you are the heart of everyone you meet. This is spontaneous love. That's why the Buddha would teach, after he would teach people that you are not the body, not the sensations, not the perceptions, not the samskara reactions, the emotional and volitional reactions, and you're not even the personal consciousness, the viewpoint. This is not me. This is not who I am. This is not myself. Ne tam mama, ne soham asmi, na me so atta. None of these khandhas, these aggregates of personhood, are me or mine. They're not who I truly am. They are not myself or the self. Mm-hmm. But his next step was always to then teach people loving kindness and compassion and sympathetic joy and equanimity, sense of beaming and feeling peace for all beings throughout the cosmos. So the Buddha is teaching you how to disidentify from narrow, alienated, selfish personhood and then realize the suprapersonal reality, the anidasana vijnana, seamless, structureless, timeless, the great unborn, uncompounded, unmade, without which there would be no liberation from that which is born, compounded, and made. But oh, listeners, oh, bhikkhus and bhikkhunis and laypersons, there is this unborn reality. This is suprapersonal, and it's inclusive of all persons. And the Buddha is such an obvious lover of persons. He's so compassionately, intimately involved as their very self, as the omnipresent self nature. And certain later Buddhist developments, like the Tathagata Garbha school, decidedly arose as a response to what they thought was a violation against the Buddha's warning about nihilism. The Buddha speaks about, anyone who denies personhood, the law of karma and rebirth, is a heretic. They are not one of my followers. And yet within the first generation, there was an unfortunate situation where a local chieftain or king asked a Buddhist monk named Nagasena. It's a famous short Buddhist collection of so-called wisdom, and some of it's wise, called the Questions of King Milinda. But the way the bhikkhu, the almsman Nagasena, answers it, it's clear he already had missed the whole point of what the Buddha was sharing. Because he basically taught anatta, which the Buddha taught as the second of the three marks of existence: impermanence, insubstantiality, anatta, and dukkha, dissatisfactoriness, not worth clinging to for your absolute well-being. Nagasena misinterpreted anatta, instead of it being a therapeutic for helping people disidentify from what's narrow and feels alienated and subject to delusion, attachment, and aversion and compulsory rebirth. No, he taught it as an ontological philosophy of no person, no being. The famous instance was, he says, look at a cart. It's actually nothing more than, nothing but its constituent parts. There is no cart. Well, there's some Buddhist scholars I know, very famous ones, well respected, massively published, people like Alex Wayman and others, the late Alex Wayman and others. He said, tell that to a farmer who has a heavy load to pull along, that there is no cart. In the same way, the Buddha, obviously, if you actually read the Pali Canon and some of the beautiful translations by expert scholars, and if you know some of the root terms of Pali, you can, if there's a passage that isn't quite clear, you can actually go in and figure out what might be a clearer meaning. The Buddha loves persons. He's all for persons. He wants to save them from narrow identification with personhood and awaken to what they are as the suprapersonal. The great 17th century Zen master of Japan, Benkei, he always taught, Fusho, you are the unborn. Don't get born. Don't get limited and contracted around this narrow sense of me and my history, my future, my spiritual plans to wake up. No, right now, you are the unborn. And that's the great wisdom of the Buddha, that at the beginning of every moment, you are this open, undefined reality, purely spiritual. You don't have to wait to the end of the moment or the end of a 5-minute or 30-minute meditation or 40-second self-inquiry process or 7 more retreats with the latest teacher coming down the pike trying to make you go pay money to learn teachings that aren't going to actually wake you up to the all-inclusive true reality of spirit. No, the Buddha says right now, at the start of every moment, you're this open vastness. One of my teachers, Sri Nisargadatta, would say, just recede back, recede back. Find out what you are prior to this arising sense of me and its agenda, its concerns and ambitions and so forth. But having awakened to what you are as the suprapersonal, Nisargadatta was very clear. Let there be the spontaneous re-identification with personhood and all persons and the whole universal play of consciousness. That's why he taught clarity and charity. Clarity and charity. And I heard him once say in my presence when I was there with a small group, he said, spirituality is like this two-step dance. Disidentification, and if it's authentic, spontaneous re-identification. Most people only notice his massive emphasis on disidentification, since most people are so thickly identified, and understandably so. Life is tough, and what happens to beings is so poignant and often traumatic. So, it was a therapeutic to disidentify, like the Buddha taught people to disidentify from the 5 elements of personhood, including the very sense of personal consciousness, or me. But then Nisargadatta, like the Buddha, didn't want to stop with just this penetrating, all-exploding wisdom. But spontaneously, if the wisdom is truly allowed to be real, then spontaneously there's all this love and compassion and empathy. I've openly quoted him in a long essay I wrote, an elaboration of a shorter essay I wrote for a friend's online journal, John Prendergast's online journal. Maharaj, he would say, yes, I often speak of waking up from personhood, but love allows me to adopt being a person for the sake of love and relationship. And some of us that had a chance to get very close to him. For instance, I used to go to his bhajan singing, his devotional singing, morning and night. Most of the people only were interested in the concepts and would come for the talks. And so there'd just be a handful of us joining some of the old Indians for the bhajans. And that's when Nisargadatta really became alive. He had these huge cymbals, the kirtal kind of things. They were giant. I'd never seen any so giant. It was the noisiest thing. I used to have to wear earplugs to prevent ear damage that I had after the first night. But that's when Maharaj would be so electric and alive. And he had this beautiful teaching, and very few people know about the vital power. What is this formless, shapeless, colorless, textureless, seamless power or vitality that's doing your life right now? It's doing everyone's lives. It's doing the whole cosmos. Without this vital power, there's no universe. There's no you. There's no thinking, feeling. You can't language. You can't handle food and swallow it and digest it. He used to say that, I have swallowed the world. It's all happening spontaneously. But he was always in marvel of this vital power of the divine, the absolute Brahman, Atman, reality, supreme self, that was pulsing through the ancient Om, the pranava. Call it the vibratory word of the Word of God in the opening prologue to the John Gospel, that very late Gospel that was created to eliminate the Gospel of Thomas that taught that the light of God is in you. Not just, I am the light, I am the way, the truth, and the light. God's light is omnipresent, as much in you as in this one.
I love that.
But this vibration that arises, Maharaj, Sri Nisargadatta, his name basically translates the natural one. It was a name he took when he started spontaneously conjuring up non-dual poetry after he'd been studying with his teacher, Sri Siddharameshwar Maharaj, and then reflecting on Maharaj's teachings, Siddharameshwar Maharaj. Sri Nisargadatta, he so clearly and powerfully and decisively, often with these amazing gestures, almost violent gestures, slacking his leg and so forth. It was that penetrating, deconstructive wisdom mode, but he had this side that you would see in the bhajans that was all about celebrating and affirming and feeling and just bathing as the love, the bliss, and the vitality, the formless, shapeless, colorless, vital power that right now is your hearing, your breathing, your feeling, your understanding of these words, what allows meaning There was an old Advaita teacher of India from going back to about the 5th century, maybe somewhere around the year 500 CE. So he's actually about 150 or 200 years before Shankara, who gave us the formal Advaita Vedanta tradition, the non-dual way of interpreting the end of the Vedas, the Vedanta. There was a sage earlier, a couple hundred years earlier, named Bhartrhari, and he was fascinated by language. He was a grammarian, but he was also a philosopher and an utterly non-dual mystic. And he was fascinated by this phenomenon of how does meaning happen, this flash of meaning between two minds or among several or many minds. He thought it was a divine phenomenon. And that's how one could understand animals. Like Ramana Maharshi understood animals and they understood him. And so forth with other beings. Anyway, there's so many wonders when we open up to not just a merely depersonalizing, merely deconstructive, this is all just a dream, and oh, it's all just a figment of my consciousness. No, that's a path to a sura, a demonhood, where you become apathetic, uncaring, callous, and you lose the miracle that this suprapersonal reality, what we are, is open, vast awareness. Shunya, open, empty. Shunyata, openness, emptiness. Reality of absolute awareness. Is personing as all these beings and relations and artistic possibilities and engaged spirituality on behalf of justice for the animals, for women, and any gender that is abused or threatened, exploited. Racism, ageism.
Tim,
it makes you spontaneously an instrument for clarity and charity, as Sri Nisargadatta said. Yes, RJ. I've done a lot of talking. I'd really like to hear more from you guys.
No, we have
We're
questions.
loving it.
Yeah. The ultimate reality, the pure awareness, the transpersonal, timeless, spaceless, dimensionless.
Yeah, what you are right now already at the beginning of every moment.
That ultimate reality is that pre-planning what's happened, the universe? Is it a pre-planned thing, or is it?
In other words, is there some kind of determinism?
Right. Would there
spontaneous, and yet it can look deterministic from a certain viewpoint, but the great wisdom teaching, this is all spontaneous. That's what Sri Nisargadatta shared with me, that I'd come early that morning and there was a morning time. That night, he called me up right in front of him. There was only about 6 people there that evening. And I've been visiting various saints and sages in Burma, and then Myanmar, and then India. And I had wanted to get there as soon as possible to Mumbai because I heard the Maharaj had throat cancer. So that first night he called me up. The last question I had ever of any spiritual teacher was what I asked him. It was something similar to that, but it was more in the sense of like, how can we help and change? And, you know, is there some kind of ultimately at bottom anything to be rectified? And he says, it's all spontaneous. Your true formless nature is spontaneous. This whole play of God is spontaneous. He often spoke about God, and in very beautiful and positive terms. I know sometimes he could be ironic and sarcastic and crude in his languaging and make fun, you know, people like Jean Dunn, one of his lovely disciples and editors of some of his teaching. She and some others, like people like Robert Powell, who actually never even met Sri Nisargadatta, but he saw some video footage, the footage we got from the Belgian fellow. They would overemphasize Maharaj's cutting and sarcastic remarks and kind of pulling down the deities like an iconoclast. Some people might almost come away thinking, after reading those particular edited collections, that Sri Nisargadatta was, like they come away with the wrong impression about the Buddha. He was some kind of atheist or agnostic at best. But Sri Nisargadatta, like the Buddha, was very sincere about these profound intelligences that he thought were like rotating the function of being like the God or governor of this cosmos. Mm-hmm. And he had great feeling. I mean, in his bhajans, the devotional singing, a lot of it was the works of Gyaneshwar, a 13th century prodigy sage who dropped the body. He went into yogic samadhi at like the age of 21 or something with all of his followers around. And they created a statue around him. And I think he's still alive, still present, not just transcendent. Gyaneshwar's poems of non-dual wisdom and non-dual devotion are very present and conspicuous in the bhajans that Sri Nisargadatta and his co-disciples of their guru and everyone sang. And so much of that is filled with devotion, non-dual devotion. I highly recommend the writings and poetry of Papa Ramdas, the East Indian Ramdas, whose father whispered the Om Shri Ram Jai Ram Jai Jai Ram mantra in his ear, and he wandered all over India, met Ramana Maharshi, was very zapped open by Ramana, and then wandered all over India and settled down in Kerala state at Ananda Ashram. Papa and his female platonic consort, Mataji Krishnabai, they visited the United States several times a few times. They visited many cities on 2 tours back in the 1950s. Papa Ramdas spoke of this para bhakti, this supreme devotion, this abheda, no differentiation bhakti, which is rooted in all the great, truly great devotional or bhakti traditions of India. And it's basically this realization that this vital power, it's conjuring you up dreamlike. There's this body-mind personing, the body-mind ego G, dear ego. The power dreaming all this up makes you a devotee and involves you in devotional activity and gratitude and celebration and love for God or the goddess and for fellow devotees and for all beings. And the object of the devotion at first seems to be a separate object or thing, a deity up there in some heaven, on some throne. I used to invite listeners in classes and satsangs and so forth over the years, still do. Visualize in your particular religious upbringing, Catholic, evangelical, Quaker, or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu, or like the more kind of theistic kinds of forms of Buddhism where they have various almost godlike Buddha figures like Amitabha or Amida Buddha, China and Japan. Visualize what it would be like to ascend right now, ascend in spirit, such you've left body behind, the ordinary mind behind, and you're just in the presence of all these gazillions of souls, and you're all kind of like one and interpenetrating, intermingling. It's hard to tell where the overlap is. And God is present. The all in all, the one who dreams us, the one who is many. This God is here. Does this God have an appearance? Does this God have a separate bodily form? Maybe for the sake of divine play, God creates a gorgeous divine mother form or divine father or beloved friend, Sri Krishna, Lord Jesus. The spirit of Elijah takes form as the ancient, beautiful, divine prophet. But do you need to remain limited with that? As the angel Jibreel or Gabriel revealed to Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, as Muslims say. When Jibreel or Gabriel elevated, raptured up Prophet Muhammad through the spheres and levels, and the same thing happened to St. Augustine. Every level, he had this rapture, but at every level of heaven, the creatures, the angels, the whatever, the figures of light would say, he made us. Don't stop here with the mere creatures. What is the unborn, the formless, the infinitely open? Shunya, shunya. Best translation for that is not empty, but open, say some of the best Buddhist scholars.
Like that.
It can mean empty in certain contexts. It's a good translation, but
Can I say,
open.
Tim,
We're open to infinity, true divinity. Yes, RJ.
would it be accurate to say, because my visualization or interpretation of emptiness would be, the transpersonal ultimate reality that you're speaking of, that I like to call it the one mind or universal consciousness. So I like to visualize emptiness as the one mind at rest. Would that be?
Now, what is this?
I'm
What
sorry?
is the one mind at rest?
Emptiness.
Yeah. And
Can
for
I say-
listeners, not have this be a mere concept, but as you speak the words, RJ, to have this be actual truth. Allow yourself, because at the beginning of each moment, you are this wide open, at rest, undefined spiritual reality. So when RJ shares the phrase, the one mind at rest, you are this, subtler than subtle. This is absolutely life-stopping, earth-stopping.
You're stopping us right now. That's amazing. James, is he blowing you away or what?
I'm in it. I'm loving
Right?
it.
This is
Can I ask Timothy, piggybacking on RJ's question about the is it pre-planned? How do you explain the mechanics of grace?
It doesn't feel machine like needing a mechanic.
The
It's more of this
architecture,
spontaneity of like, look at just, anyone who gardens or farms or has, little shoots they take from a house plant and they replant somewhere else. Organic growth is stupendous. The very ancient word that the most ancient wisdom sages, non-dual wisdom sages on this planet, the seers of the Upanishads, like Yajnavalkya, who is identified as probably the father of non-dual wisdom for all of humanity. He's the one in the earliest Upanishad, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the secret forest teaching. They use this word Brahman. And it appears in a text associated with Yajnavalkya right before that first Upanishad. It's when some of these sages are coming out of this Vedic ritualism, this where they're offering ghee and milk and meat into the fire. Those ancient Brahmins weren't vegan, unfortunately. And they, along with the American cowboys and the ancient Hebrews, they gave us cattle culture and animal husbandry, which is now, 18 or 20 or 30 or 50% of global warming greenhouse gases, depending on which science you're looking at. The science I respect says it's really like 40 or 50% actually, because you have to calibrate methane on the shorter time frame. So anyway, these ancient animal herders, and in the case of ancient India, they came from the south, what we think of southern Russian, Asian steppes, grasslands, and they came down into the subcontinent, what is today Pakistan and India. And they kind of went southwest too into what is present-day Iran. They were instrumental in giving rise later to the whole Persian culture. You can just see all the similarities linguistically. People like Michael Witzel, Harvard and places have proven all these links. So these ancient Vedic people, there was a reaction to all that superstitious magic and myth-making. And sages like Yajnavalkya began to speak of this reality that's so prior to, so beyond, so much the source and substance of everything, including our little piddling magic rituals, religious, early myth-making kind of religious thinking. And Yajnavalkya and others, they introduced this term Brahman, the great reality. It's a neuter noun form, not to be confused with that Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. Brahma, the creator aspect of God, Vishnu, the sustainer aspect of God, sustaining the cosmos, and Shiva, the absorber, the so-called destroyer, the one who sucks the dream of creation back into God's self. Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. Brahma is a masculine noun form, a male god. The Buddha speaks of Prajapati, which is like the Hindu Brahma figure. But Brahman is this genderless, suprapersonal absolute. And Brahman gives rise to the dream of the cosmos through the Om, the Pranava, the root vibration, speech, Vach, vibration of God, Brahman. Organically, Brahman grows a cosmos, conjures a cosmos like a dream within God's self, not as something separate. Go to medieval illustrated Bible manuscripts like in the Catholic monasteries, and they draw a God and often try to draw a Trinity. It was originally 3 guys at a table, and then it was 2 guys, Father and Son, and a little bird. And they are separate from the world. And God is operating on the world as a separate entity. And of course, our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson and others, were mainly deists. They did not accept the formulations and creeds of the Catholic or Protestant churches. Their deism, unfortunately, bought into the same model of treating the whole cosmos like clockwork. And in such a clockwork cosmos, you could have determinism, fate. But the ancient Vedanta wisdom of Yajnavalkya and other subtler than subtle sages, these are amazing guys. They figured out all the pranas and longevity stuff and all sorts of things. The language, ancient Sanskrit is a marvel. How these guys came up with Sanskrit. It makes Latin look like, the gibberish of 4-year-olds. Anyway, they realize that the Brahman is giving rise organically to a cosmos as a dream within. And so Brahman suffuses and permeates everything and everyone. Everything and everyone. And everything and everyone is jada, inert, does not have its own sentience or self-nature. This Brahman is the sentience. So if you're experiencing pain, if you accidentally touch a hot stove, or your heart is hearing about, say, what's going on in Ukraine, or any number of hot spots around the world, or in the community, where there's been a murder, a rape, a wife beating, abuse of children, that sentience and that experience is God or the Brahman experiencing what it's like to be a human, or an animal in one of the factory farms, a little veal calf who can't turn around. It's going to be butchered, after a monstrously imposed life of suffering. So the Buddha and certain others would speak that there is a certain kind of clockwork quality, and that's the law of karma. But it's subtler than just, I'm experiencing something unpleasant, therefore I must have done something very nasty to someone else. I think many people today are very innocent beings, very high beings, very evolved spiritually in terms of what the personal consciousness has been transformed to be. The pragmatic, empirical level, the phenomenal level of personal consciousness. That's where enlightenment and awakening and the utter transformation into a saint, a sage, an arhat. If you're just an armchair concept maker, that's nothing. And then you go and abuse your wife and kids, or secretly connive ambitiously to get more followers or more money or something. That's not realization. Allowing the real to be truly real in and through you with all the cornucopia of bountiful virtues, the true living Buddhas and Christs and sages, those who've been made godly by awakening to God. As Meister Eckhart said, just empty out. You're totally dead and buried in God, and then God is your reality. God, as St. John of the Cross said, using your faculties to express and act and feel and think. The law of karma is playing out in ways that can seem like tit for tat in this more mechanical way, but I think there's many beings who are very high, advanced, transformed beings. They're like angels in human form, and they're taking on the world's karma through their own, what look like afflictions and tremendous tests of equanimity, certain abuses and injustices that we could legally say have been wrought on them by perpetrators. All sorts of intensity that can be called painful, but it's their breathing in that pain equanimously, being the pain, releasing, knowing that each moment of pain is being released, and at the start of each moment, they're wide open for whatever arises, painful, pleasurable. They are free, but they're taking on what we would call terrible pain. And I think that taking on of karma is a form of spontaneous, divine celebrating and dancing with and as the whole kind of mechanical, deterministic play of karma. And I think many beings, it's like they're getting speeded up. You know, Shankara spoke of the great virtue of mumukshutva. It was a prerequisite for actually hearing the teaching. True sincerity, true earnestness. One of my teachers, Sri Nisargadatta, he so often spoke of this earnestness. It was about being real, about being opened up, about knowing by being that there is only this absolute awareness, playing as this whole universal play of consciousness and animating as this vital power, such that without this power, you'd fall over dead. There'd be no cosmos at all. So it's very alive and pulsating, like the Kashmir Shaiva spanda notion. And the great saint named Kabir was such an inspiration to Guru Nanak and the Sikhs, another nirguna, formless bhakti, devotional poet saints. Kabir spoke about how the God, the true divine, is not just formless, but vibrating as this body and all bodies, and our relationships and our comings and goings and our beautiful interactions. Praise God. Hare Ram, Hare Ram, Hare Ram. Jaya Jagadisha Hare. Om. Om. Om.
Beautiful.
That is beautiful. Could I ask you one question?
Oh, you can ask many, and just be aware that, you know, this fellow kissed the Blarney Stone and was born at Gemini and grew up in Catholic schools and through high school, and then did a lot of reading of the sagely traditions and wrote a doctoral dissertation and master's thesis about different aspects, and some big writings like a big encyclopedia of Chan and Zen that should be out next year, and
Wow.
a spirituality and film book that's about 1,400 pages, documentaries and biopics about saints and sages and religion, and beautiful feature films that wake people up to empathy. So you can ask questions, RJ or James, but be aware there's going to be a train of Dharma verbiage which might
You're a wealth of
carry away everyone.
Your wealth of wisdom and knowledge, so we would love answers to our questions. Also, at the end of the podcast, we'd like for you to promote anything that you're currently working on, anything you have going on.
I promote God, your true nature. What are you, dear one, on the near open end of all experiencing? I can't promote that because you are this. Knowing by being, you are this. So Timothy's just a dream figment. Beautiful divine dream.
What you just said is actually deals with my. Well, we're asking that we keep asking the same question about pre-planned. I heard the Buddha. I'm not sure where I read it from, but he said destiny is like, because that's our question, destiny or pre-planned. The Buddha, I believe, said destiny is half the story, because there's no destiny without action. You got to do something.
Yes.
That's. Would you say yes?
Yes, and I would just qualify it. Everything can be nuanced. He may have lived even before the Buddha. There does seem now to be some historicity for Krishna of Mathura and places, Vrindavan. And there's a scholar named Edwin Bryant who's written about what he thinks can be established as some historicity markers that Krishna wasn't merely a legend, like the more ancient Rama of the Ramayana epic. We have no historicity about Lord Rama and his wife Sita and brother Lakshman and Hanuman and Ravana, the demon king. We don't have any historicity for that, but we seem to have some historicity, little bits and pieces for Krishna. Krishna, his so-called teachings to Lord Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God, Gita, Song of Bhagavad, he teaches you are not the doer, I am the doer. And Sri Nisargadatta teaches it's the vital power doing everything. So the Buddha wants us to strive on. What were his last words? Be a light unto yourself. Strive on, O listeners, O bhikkhus and bhikkhunis and lay persons. Strive on. But all strivings and doings, if we really feel into and examine what is the energy of intention and actual action, movement, behavior, flowing, it's a flowing in energy. And what is the source and substance and animating power that allows action? Like, I'll invite each of us in a moment to raise our left hand. 3, 2, 1. Let's do it again. With mind at rest, body at rest, out of the void, field of consciousness, a body, an intention. Let's raise the hand the next moment. What was the chi energy or pranava, Om power, the vital force, the subtle energy that allowed a thought in the mind becoming an intention to become actualized as an action? That's mind over matter. Mm. Yeah. Again, matter, the illusion of matter. You think this is solid? Guess what? Made of tissues, made of cells, made of molecules, made of atoms, made of subatomic mystery. Wavicles, particles that are actually also waves. A paradox. Strictly a contradiction. How can that which is localized as a particle be spread out in space-time as a probability wave emanating out of the quantum foam? So, the beginning of every moment, you're always already free, open, undefined. A great play of ego-jis, these personal consciousnesses or souls, jivas, as the Buddha and ancient folks in India, and actually had other words like pugdala and so forth, the Buddha uses to refer to the individual personal consciousness, or what we would call the soul. You can think of those as the personal consciousness within this universal consciousness field that's coming up with these gazillions of persons. The 8 billion human persons and the animals, persons that are countless trillions. I mean, we kill over 1 trillion of them every year in the meat, poultry, fish farm, and deep sea fishing. Ugly enterprise, and we don't need it. It's making everyone sick with inflammation. That's why so many of those athletes go plant-based. More and more of them going plant-based, following Tom Brady and the great top tennis player Novak Djokovic and others, some of these great Olympiads, because it cuts all inflammation and everything that does all the damage to your arteries and subtle biochemical hormonal processes. So, all these diseases like heart disease and cancer and diabetes and hypertension, and reverse almost all of them with plant-based eating.
I agree
so
with that.
All these persons, we disrespect them, and then we eat them, and then poison ourselves, and then we also destroy, the oceans with dead zones from manure pools, from hog farms in Carolina and Georgia and places. So in every way it's destructive, and it doesn't honor our fellow persons on this planet. And then as a culture, we are very unlike traditional cultures, which also honored all the nature spirits and our ancestors and angels and spirit guides. So we're very narrowly focused on the human enterprise, and it's all carried off in a very alienated, sadly, tragically, very alienated way, and it causes abuse and suffering and neglect and tax policies from the right wing that rewards the top fraction of the top 1% and lets everyone else be in this kind of sink or swim anxiety, a basic struggle in the richest nation on earth. Economic survival becomes traumatic for, at least 30-40% of the citizens. So let us respect fellow persons, and the way we do is not by some do-gooder, good intentions kind of thing. It's by waking up to this Brahman, Atman, Godhead, Tao reality that is conjuring up all these dear persons, and is their very sentience, and is their energy of intention and activity, doing, striving for justice and goodness and kindness, creativity, fun, entertaining each other. I mean, when you wake up to this, it is the most entertaining realization as well. Your whole heart, mind, every corner just lights up. It's like all your inner organs are smiling, gently dancing and laughing over the stupendous play of this formless absolute spirit that can play as this incredibly variegated cosmos. And all that happens, some of which seems destined to the law of karma.
Right.
Much of it is just amazing lila, play, krida. It's like a divine game of the absolute, changeless, quiescent, unaffectable, because purely spiritual. No boundaries, no structure, no seam. So it's seamless. This reality comes up with this incredible play. Like one actor, imagine an actor who could move superluminally faster than the speed of light. The physicist John Wheeler once said 40 or 50 years ago that we cannot disprove the idea that the entire physical cosmos is a single photon.
Right.
Moving superluminally and creating all these structures and apparently other kind of particles, wavicles. So imagine an actor who could, on stage, create all the most amazing props and changes of scenery and all these amazing characters and male, female, old, young, good, evil, everything in between. Music, dance, light shows. The vibratory power of all that.
I wrote something like that.
Allahu Akbar.
In my last book, I wrote that forget Broadway. This is the play of plays, and the lighting rig is the stars and the sun, and you're the audience, you're the stage set, you're the whole, you're the floorboards, you're the whole thing.
Yeah, even when the floorboards might be rotting and two actors fall through and break their knee or something. Hey, going back to the Upanishads, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, as I recall, it's Yajnavalkya who gives this teaching about not just the unseen seer of seeing, which thou art, the unheard hearer of hearing, the unsensed sensor or host for sensing, the unthought thinker or host for thinking. He also, and there's so much wisdom there, about the very notion of an other, that root delusion that there's a split in existential reality, an actual split, not just pragmatically, conventionally between male, female, RJ's viewpoint, James' viewpoint, Timothy's viewpoint, the viewpoint of the birds and bugs outside. That there is no fundamental split. Like Yajnavalkya taught, the arising of fear, lust, hatred, everything, all arises from that root split. So know that there is only the Brahman, all pervasive, the one single self in all beings, animating them through the Om, the Pranava, later the word Shakti, Chi energy in the East. And that is doing all this cosmos non-dually. But then Yajnavalkya teaches Brahman is also the differentiation, the veils between the worlds, the dike. Think of like the wall that would keep certain farm plots from flooding or allow moisture to accumulate within a farm plot. You need like raised earth, and they often had pathways. People would walk back and forth on these raised earthen dikes or something. One of the lines in the most ancient Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka, is the divine is not only the oneness, the essential oneness of all beings, but also this which creates the useful differentiation between I and thou, thou and I. You know, think of trying to drive a car down a freeway and suddenly you're flashing on being all your ancestors and all the spirits and nature spirits and everything, and you crash the car. So there's this useful veil, this useful dividing line, a whole bunch of these dividing lines that allow the great Leela, the great play, the Broadway play. It's very broad, and the divine is omnipresently suffused and pervasively manifesting as each and every one. The greater glory of God.
And it's the wayless, it's the very broad and the wayless way.
The pathless path. When people think of God or reality or spiritual realization as an it or a that, they've immediately created a gap. In a sense of a path needs to happen. I would gently ask, where is there? What is right here? Closer than your eyeballs, closer than the brain, closer than thought, at the beginning of each moment, before you have thoughts about realization, enlightenment, who's enlightened and who's not. Before all of that, right now, always now, what are you? This open spirit. Maharaj, Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj would say, receive back as this. Or another metaphor would just be, stop, let the whole pretense of space, time, and me getting somewhere spiritually, let all of it just fall off. What are you now? Naked.
Right.
Utterly unclothed with any cosmos, any ambition, any striving, any escaping, any craving, as the Buddha said.
I'm sure you're familiar with Alan Watts.
Yeah, he was a delight. I discovered him about 6 years after the initial spontaneous, profound waking up experiences in the backyard when I was 16. I think I was actually about 21. I was just finished all my studies at University of California, Santa Cruz, and I would go to the library, and in the listening section, back then in that era of actual LPs of talks,